3, 2, 1, 0. All engine running. Liftoff. We have a liftoff. 32 minutes past the hour. Liftoff on Apollo 11.
Welcome to Roots of Reality. I'm your host, Ben Baumann, and today we're going to be talking about Phase 17, World War II. So about 80 years ago, and about 20 years after World War I, the world would find itself in another war even more devastating than the first. This was World War II, and this is how it happened. So World War II ultimately began as a war where the Axis powers led by Nazi Germany under dictator Adolf Hitler, Japan under Emperor Hirohito, and Italy under dictator Benito Mussolini formed an alliance together to create large empires around the world. Against the Allied powers led by the British Empire under Prime Minister Winston Churchill, the Soviet Union under dictator Joseph Stalin, and the United States of America under President Franklin D. Roosevelt, and later President Harry Truman. Also, this was a war that involved even more of the world than World War I and included significant fighting in Asia and Africa in addition to Europe. You see, this all started with Germany. After the First World War, Germany was angry for being punished for World War I and was having major economic problems due to the punishment that they received due to their role in World War I. Combined with the effects of the global Great Depression around the world, the German economy was doing very badly as a result. And because of this was highly unstable, causing a struggle for power in Germany. And Germany's attempt at forming a lasting, socialist-based democracy after World War I would fail, especially after that global economic crisis of 1929. Thus, this left an opening for another German socialist group led by the ultra-nationalistic socialist named Adolf Hitler, who managed to take advantage of the chaos in the nation by using the anger of the German population to help fuel his radical political ideas. And this socialist group would be known as the Nazis, which formed their ideology based on a fake document created in Russia called the Protocols of the Elders of Zion. And this was anti-Jewish propaganda and spread around the world, causing anti-Jewish views among nationalists across Europe and America, promoting false ideas that the Jews secretly caused World War I in order to conquer the world and had the goal of getting rid of Christian civilization. And in addition to this, the Nazi Party also blamed the German Democratic Socialists, who they felt were responsible for the political and economic disaster after World War I, in addition to the Jews. So Adolf Hitler and the Nazi Party would eventually gain enough support and influence in government to get Hitler elected Chancellor of Germany, becoming the official leader of the nation via a deal with other political parties that believed they could keep Hitler from acting on his crazy ideas if they were willing to compromise, knowing that the Nazi Party was growing and someone had to be there politically to try to keep them in check. This wouldn't happen though, as Hitler was still able to release his aggressive German nationalism to the world based on the idea that the Jews were the number one enemy of Germany. Thus, he set out to end the class and political differences of the German people, to unify and purify the ethnic Germans to defend Germany against the Jews of the world. Slowly, Germany under Hitler began getting rid of opposition leaders through new elections, arrests, and enacting laws that would help them gain complete control over the nation. As a result, Nazi Germany, under the German dictator Adolf Hitler, officially began in 1933. From here, Hitler began embracing his ambitions to expand German territory to recreate a great empire, as well as conquer all territories he believed where Jews had an influence, like the Soviet Union. And he began secretly and illegally rebuilding the German military despite the Treaty of World War I, which didn't allow for that. And he even managed to sign a treaty with the British to increase the German Navy. And by 1936, Hitler moved the German military to the Rhineland, which was a part of Germany, which is part of Germany that was supposed to remain neutral. And by doing this, he was breaking the Treaty of World War I once again. But the British and French Empire did nothing, thus showing that the treaty would not be enforced, giving Nazi Germany the power to do whatever they wanted with their country now that the treaty was officially dead. and Nazi Germany would then build a new powerful military as a result. Next, in 1936 and 1937, Nazi Germany, Japan, and Italy would form an alliance against the communists of the world, and after this, Nazi Germany began this expansion by first getting control of Austria, then it began taking parts of Czechoslovakia, which the British and French helped them get via political pressure on Czechoslovakia, thinking that by giving Nazi Germany some of this territory in Czechoslovakia, it would help prevent another war. But instead, it actually had the opposite effect because it gave Hitler a taste for getting more power, which is what he wanted and which he wanted to continue to do, making Nazi Germany, in fact, more aggressive as a result. And the Nazis would also then get parts of Lithuania later as well, while in Asia, Japan began expanding too by invading China. So in Europe, Hitler then set his eyes on Poland, which was another place he needed to travel through to eventually conquer the Soviet Union. At first, the Nazis tried to negotiate a deal with Poland to be an ally and get some Polish territory, but Poland rejected their offer. In turn, Hitler ironically then created a deal with the Soviet dictator Joseph Stalin called the German-Soviet Non-Aggression Pact, where the two nations agreed to divide Eastern Europe together via conquest. In 1939, Nazi Germany invaded Poland from the west and the Soviets invaded from the east, which led to the British Empire declaring war on Nazi Germany, and the British and French Empire also would supply aid to Poland. Everyone then on the Allied powers side started to realize that Nazi Germany was rebuilding an empire. In turn, Poland would be conquered by Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union, splitting the nation between them, and the Soviet Union would also conquer Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania as part of the deal, and later Finland. Then, in 1940, Nazi Germany began conquering parts of Western Europe, taking control of Denmark, Norway, the Netherlands, France, Belgium, and Luxembourg, leaving only the British Empire left to fight against the Nazis in Western Europe. However, the British Empire was not falling to the Nazis as quickly as Hitler would have liked, and Hitler thought the British Empire would fall quickly, allowing him to then invade the Soviet Union. But this did not go as planned for Hitler, and he found himself having to delay that invasion, not only because the British were taking longer to conquer, but also Italy was struggling in its conquest of North Africa and Greece, so they had to help Italy. And in the meantime, Nazi Germany was still working on trying to conquer Yugoslavia as well, which they never would. And because of all this, Nazi Germany then decided to change their plans, feeling that they couldn't wait any longer, they needed to invade the Soviet Union now. And so this put the Nazis in a dangerous situation where they're fighting in Eastern Europe and Western Europe, which is usually considered to be a dangerous military strategy because you're spreading your military force too much, leaving it vulnerable to collapse. However, Hitler believed he could conquer the Soviet Union quickly before the Russian winter, just like he thought he could conquer the British quickly. So in 1941, after Nazi Germany seemed to be moving quickly towards conquering more of the Soviet Union near Moscow, the Nazi expansion started to slow down more and more. And this was due to a combination of factors. First, the Soviets were helped by the Russian winter coming a bit earlier than expected, which helped slow the Nazi army, and the Nazi army wasn't prepared for winter. In addition, the Soviet military intelligence learned that Japan was not going to invade the Soviet Union, and Japan and the Soviet Union agreed not to fight each other. So the Soviet Union no longer had to keep military forces in Asia to prevent an invasion from Japan, and they ended up moving all their forces to Western Europe to help fight off the Nazis. And as a result, this helped slow Nazi Germany's advance as well. Meanwhile, with every place Nazi Germany was conquering to build this Third Reich empire, everywhere they went, they would try to get rid of the Jews across Europe through systematic extermination, eventually killing 6 million people by the end of the war. Now, turning back to Asia, Japan kept moving deeper into China, and as a result, the United States of America, upset by this action in Asia, put economic sanctions on Japan, restricting important materials and oil to Japan, which was important to the Japanese war effort and something they needed to create and maintain this empire they were trying to build. And because of this, Japan decided that they must declare war on the United States if they can't negotiate some type of deal with the US. The US demanded Japan leave the alliance with Nazi Germany and Italy and leave China as well, which Japan declined, and thus the Japanese then planned a secret attack on the United States of America, understanding that they could have to go to war with them eventually. And the Japanese believed that it would be hard for the Americans and the British as well, who had colonies in Asia, and meanwhile also the US controlled the Philippines at the time. They felt it would be hard for the Allied powers to fight Japan in Asia, given their lack of experience and their lack of preparation for such a fight, given the complexity of the terrain in Asia when you have all these different islands in the region, and it's a very different type of warfare. So as a result, Japan believed they could defeat the US and the British and create their large empire in Asia if war was necessary. They decided to go ahead with this sneak attack on the United States, hoping to cause major damage to the American Navy to further prevent American interference in Japan's conquest in Asia. And Japan felt that after hitting the US, it would be too much effort for democracies like America to try and fight Japan, given all the expenses it entailed and just how complicated it would be to move all these forces to Asia to fight. So really the mentality was that if they can attack the US and hit them hard enough, causing enough problems for the United States of America, that the United States would basically just decide it wasn't possible to really prevent the Japanese goal of creating an empire in Asia. So Japan decided to bomb the American naval base Pearl Harbor in the state of Hawaii in hopes of crushing the American Navy in Asia. However, though causing significant damage to the Navy, they made some major mistakes because all three of the American aircraft carriers, which were the most powerful American ships, were not there at the time, and Japan did not attack the important oil supplies in Hawaii. Thus, the Japanese effort, though caused significant damage, was not as successful as they hoped. In addition, this actually didn't make the US feel like they shouldn't get involved in a war with Japan, but rather upset many Americans, and the United States of America then declared war on Japan and Germany as a result, and rebuilt and improved their navy faster than Japan could have expected. However, prior to this bombing of Pearl Harbor, the Americans once again had this policy of isolationism due to the events of World War I, not wanting to get into another war like that. But once again, things became too hard to ignore and too dangerous as these dictatorships were moving across the world trying to conquer more and more territory. And so the United States eventually got in the war as a result. So later in 1942, Japan would expand its control over Asia, conquering Singapore, Burma, and the Dutch East Indies, which is modern-day Indonesia. Things in Asia, though, would soon change after the United States of America defeated Japan at the huge Battle of Midway, which was this gigantic naval battle with large aircraft carriers firing at each other, which the United States destroyed 4 Japanese aircraft carriers, their most powerful ships. And after this battle, Japan realized that winning the war was unlikely. However, Japan had not prepared for ending this war and didn't know how to tell the people of Japan that they would not win the war and they would eventually have to surrender, especially since culturally Japanese people were very much against the idea of surrendering. It was considered dishonorable, and the dictatorship in Japan never told the Japanese people about their defeats, but only their victories. So Japan decided to keep fighting in hopes of getting a better end-of-war terms, since the Allied powers wanted only unconditional surrender. Then, later in 1943, the United States of America, which was focusing most of its attention at the time in Asia, finally had built a military that was powerful enough to fight large operations to reconquer territory for its allies, having a big influence on the war. And though they were involved in Western Europe, from the start of the war, they became more and more involved now after 1943. Now moving back to the battles between Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union. In 1943, this would change as well, as the Soviet Union began pushing back the Nazi invasion through their enormous victory at the Battle of Stalingrad in the Soviet Union, and the British and Americans then defeated the Italian and Nazi German conquest of North Africa, and then Italy was defeated. Then in 1944, the Normandy invasion changed the war in Western Europe as the Allies, led by the British and Americans, pushed Nazi Germany out of Western Europe back to Germany. And from here, the Soviets from the Eastern Europe and the Americans and British from Western Europe began pushing the Nazis back more and more until Nazi Germany was becoming surrounded. And in the West, there was one last big battle called the Battle of the Bulge, which was the last German attempt to turn the war back in their favor in Western Europe, but they ultimately lost. And because of this, the British and American forces conquered the German capital in Berlin from the west, and the Soviets conquered Berlin from the east, and Hitler then would commit suicide in 1945. In Asia, by 1945, the United States of America was beating back Japan's military and getting closer to Japan by defeating the Japanese on this island-to-island warfare where you're hopping from one island to the next, defeating the Japanese and pushing them back and getting closer and closer to the Japanese mainland. The Americans then were determined that they needed to conquer another island called Iwo Jima, and they needed this strategically so that they could bomb the Japanese mainland in hopes of forcing a Japanese surrender. And the Americans were eventually able to conquer this island, which got them close enough to bomb the main part of Japan. Thus, from here, the US began firebombing Japanese cities, including Tokyo, destroying 25% of the city, killing lots of people in the process. These were really deadly bombs. And the Americans then, after this, were hoping that Japan would surrender without requiring a land invasion from the Americans, which the Americans feared would have killed many more people in the process. Because if you're going to do a land invasion, that means you have to use a lot more people and you have to invade the mainland part of Japan. You're not just fighting on islands anymore, but you're actually fighting in the heart of Japan, which is way more complicated and way more dangerous. But because Japan was still not showing any signs of surrendering, the Americans decided that they would next need to take another important island called Okinawa, knowing it was needed in case that they had to do a land invasion of Japan, which they would conquer as well. So, lastly, in 1945, the United States of America, still not able to get Japan to surrender, became the first nation in history to use a newly invented nuclear weapon called the atomic bomb, which Albert Einstein, who fled Germany to the US, warned the American government that someone needed to create this atomic bomb before the Nazis did. And so the United States of America created what was called the Manhattan Project and decided to create this new weapon and felt that this weapon could prevent the need for a land invasion by forcing Japan to surrender sooner and kill less people in the process. In addition, in a meeting with Allied powers at what was known as the Potsdam Conference, the United States discussed how to end the war with Japan with the other Allied powers like the Soviet Union and the British. And the United States of America then told the Soviet Union that they had a new weapon that they would use on Japan if they didn't surrender. And the Soviet Union agreed that they would also declare war on Japan if Japan didn't surrender, and that they would invade the Japanese conquered territory of Manchuria in China. And an important note about this is that before this conference, Japan was actually trying to get in contact with the Soviet Union because they were still not yet at war with each other. And Japan was hoping that they could work with the Soviet Union to get a better deal to end the war. However, it was too late and the Soviets had already made it to this conference and made this deal with the Allied powers. So, after this conference, the Allied powers told Japan to surrender, and they told Japan of their requirements of surrendering, but Japan rejected their offer. So on August 6, 1945, the atomic bomb was dropped on the city of Hiroshima in Japan, and on August 8th, the Soviet Union declared war on Japan. And still, Japan did not surrender, and then on August 9th, another atomic bomb was dropped on the city of Nagasaki. And finally, on August 10th, the Japanese agreed to surrender, something that the Japanese couldn't imagine doing, and something that felt extremely wrong in Japanese culture, and something that was dishonorable. In fact, even after the second atomic bomb was dropped, about 50% of the military leaders in Japan still felt that Japan should keep fighting and that they shouldn't surrender. But the Japanese Emperor Hirohito felt that they couldn't go on any longer and that this was something that they couldn't fight. And so he then was the one to break the tie and made it so Japanese would surrender. So this then begs the question that is often debated: was dropping the atomic bomb necessary? So before dropping the bombs, the United States of America had determined that a land invasion of Japan would be the only path to force Japan to surrender, which was projected to have killed many more people in the war. As a result, the American President Harry Truman felt the atomic bomb could prevent the need for a land invasion and more firebombing of Japan, feeling that in the long run, it would likely save thousands of more lives in the process, when many had already been killed due to the fighting with Japan. In fact, the firebombing in Japan killed more people than the atomic bombs did. And Harry Truman also felt the political pressure of losing more American lives, something that he did not want to have happen. However, some have argued at the same time on its way to surrendering before the bombs were dropped. However, the available evidence to the Americans at the time suggested, much like Germany, that Japan was going to fight until the very end. In addition, the Americans had the goal of ending the war as soon as possible and were not in the mood to wait for Japan to surrender, especially after the earlier offers to surrender were refused. Thus, nearly all American politicians, military leaders, and scientists working on the atomic bomb believed that using the bombs were justified. Now, another notable detail that some people will argue about is that because the American Navy had surrounded Japan, preventing supplies from coming into Japan from its recently conquered colonies, that Japan was already going to surrender anyway because of their economic issues and also the fact that there was still firebombing going on, destroying Japanese cities all over the country, shortening important supplies in the mainland like food and oil even more. Unfortunately, though, this is only speculation, and you really don't know if that was going to happen. And it's not clear, even if the Japanese were going to surrender, how long that would take, which would also cost the US a lot more money, and it could cost more lives, and it was something that was just unpredictable. Therefore, despite this detail being very important, the situation was obviously more complex than this, and again, there was no evidence that Japan was going to surrender anytime soon. So after the bombs were dropped and the Japanese surrendered, around the world, most people at the time did not blame the Americans for doing it, especially given the millions of people Japan had killed trying to conquer Asian nations to create this large empire. Thus, in history, it is always possible to talk about hypothetical situations as to whether if different decisions were made and what decisions should or shouldn't have been made, but unfortunately, the extra time and additional information that we have in the future to look back on these historical problems are not always available to the decision makers. So it was not an easy choice regardless, and the Americans made the choice that they felt was correct based on the evidence that they had, to end the war as fast as possible, hoping to kill as few people as possible against an enemy that had started the war with them to begin with, and showed no signs of surrendering. And therefore, ultimately, there is not enough evidence to suggest it was the wrong decision, despite the horrific effects it had. In turn, when the Japanese finally decided to surrender, Truman agreed to let the Japanese Emperor Hirohito stay in power, despite originally wanting him to leave power, feeling that having to drop more atomic bombs to get rid of him was not worth killing more people. So, when talking about the overall results of World War II, after the war, up to 50 million people had died, making it the most deadly war in human history. And this war also marked another major turning point in the development of military technology with the creation of powerful tanks, airplanes, naval battleships, computers, radar, and nuclear weapons, all of which did not play a big role or any role at all in World War I. In addition, once again, the United States of America survived another world war, basically untouched and undamaged. This then made the United States of America into the most powerful nation in the world after World War II. And as for the Axis powers that lost the war, the Japanese Empire ended, but the Japanese Emperor Hirohito was allowed to remain in power under the control of the United States of America. The Nazi German Empire ended, and Western Germany was controlled by the United States of America, the French Empire, and the British Empire, and Eastern Germany was controlled by the Soviet Union. And lastly, the Italian dictatorship under Benito Mussolini would lose power and he would be executed. So ultimately, when looking back at this war, it really showed once again the true dangers of radical nationalism and the old human goal of trying to create these empires through conquest. And it also showed just how vulnerable, unstable nations as we saw in Nazi Germany, are to this type of dangerous nationalism and how dangerous they themselves can be, especially if they become strong enough to conquer other nations. Most importantly, though, once again, democracy was victorious, preventing dictatorships from becoming the most powerful nations in the world. Unfortunately, though, these global conflicts were not quite done yet. As a new phase in history began after these two world wars, as the world then found itself in a new type of war, and this would become the Cold War. So thank you for listening to this episode. Please feel free to email me, leave some comments, message me on social media, share with your friends, and remember, as always, billions of years led to you, so make the most.